Have you ever wondered what secrets lie hidden in the pages of a diary you were never meant to read? Imagine for a moment that in your hands is a fragile book, its cover worn down by time, the ink faded into sepia shadows, and yet inside every word is alive with whispers of despair, longing, and confessions too dark to share aloud. Before we step into this journey together, take just a second to like this video. Tell me where you are listening from, and subscribe to the channel if you are ready to explore. Only if you truly feel ready. And now, let us begin. A diary is not just a record. It is a mirror that reflects the rawest parts of human life, fears that could not be spoken, grief that had no audience, and sins too heavy to confess anywhere else. In every era, across every culture, men and women have poured their shadows into paper, believing perhaps that by writing they could exorcise what haunted them. Yet these pages did not dissolve the darkness. They preserved it. They bottled it. And centuries later, we find ourselves daring to open those bottles, releasing emotions as sharp and fresh as the day they were first written. Why are diaries so fascinating? Perhaps because they are the most honest lies we will ever encounter. No one writes for the public eye in a diary, not truly. Even when they imagine an audience, it is still a private performance. The soldier writes not to inspire, but to survive. The prisoner writes not for sympathy, but to endure the endless ticking of the clock. The young girl writes not to craft poetry, but because the silence of her room demands a witness. These are not crafted speeches, they are unfiltered confessions. But here lies the haunting question. What happens when those confessions are darker than we can imagine? What happens when ink becomes the last trace of a scream? Tonight, as you listen, you will travel with me through centuries of such pages. You will step into battlefields where ink mixed with blood. You will hear the trembling scratch of pens in plague-ridden villages. You will descend into the secret chambers of castles where servants wrote truths that kings would have burned. And yes, sometimes you will laugh, because even in the darkest diaries, humor survives like a candle refusing to go out. Think of this moment, someone, hundreds of years ago, sitting alone under candlelight, their hand shaking as they wrote, never imagining that you, across oceans of time, would one day read their words. You are about to trespass into their minds. Some would call it voyeurism, others archaeology. I call it listening to ghosts. And as we move deeper into these stories, you must ask yourself, if your diary were discovered centuries from now, what darkness would be revealed? What truths would you never want anyone to read? Remember this, every diary is both a key and a lock. It opens a door into one soul, while locking away another secret forever. As we begin with the first stories, let your imagination wander, but tread carefully, for these are not simply pages. They are confessions that refuse to die. Picture the battlefield, not as a grand painting with flags and victories, but as a muddy rain-soaked pit where men are reduced to trembling shadows. You crouch in the trench, your boots heavy with filth, your hands stiff from the cold, and in your breast pocket rests a small diary, the only possession untouched by the war's chaos. What would you write if tonight were your last? Would it be a message of love, or a desperate plea to God, or perhaps nothing at all, because words fail when bombs scream louder than prayers? The diaries of soldiers are windows into this abyss. Unlike official reports written for generals, these fragile notebooks were written for no one, sometimes even hidden from fellow comrades. In the First World War, for example, young soldiers scrawled lines under flickering candle stubs, confessing fears of never returning home, mocking the absurdity of orders that sent them crawling through mud like worms, or joking darkly about how bad the rations smelled compared to corpses. Yes, humor survived even here, because humor is the last armor when steel helmets cannot protect the mind. One entry from a 19-year-old soldier reads simply, "I am afraid of tomorrow, not because of the bullets, but because I might still be alive when the shells fall." In that one sentence, you can taste the paradox of war, the dread of dying, and the dread of surviving to suffer longer. Diaries caught this contradiction with brutal honesty. They became confessionals without priests, where men bared their souls not to be forgiven, but simply to remain human for another day. Imagine holding such a diary now. The paper is damp, edges curling, stained not only with ink but with mud, sweat, and sometimes blood. The handwriting shakes, Letters slant as if the writer was ducking from artillery fire. Every page is a battlefield frozen in script. Reading it, you do not see heroic charges or waving banners. You see the lice crawling in uniforms, the nightmares of gas attacks, the way laughter suddenly broke in the middle of horror because someone slipped face first into the trench muck. It is grotesque and heartbreaking, yet also strangely alive. Why do these soldier diaries fascinate us? Because they strip war of its polished narrative. They tell you that bravery often smelled like fear. That comradeship was built not in speeches but in shared cigarettes, in stealing 5 minutes of sleep, in writing a final letter by candlelight before dawn assaults. They remind us that history's greatest battles were fought not only with rifles, but also with pens scratching across paper, desperate to record what otherwise would vanish into silence. Now, here's a thought experiment for you. If you were trapped in such a trench tonight, diary in hand, what would you write to those you love? Would you soften the truth to spare them pain, or would you spill the horror exactly as you lived it? And deeper still, would you even want your words to survive, knowing that someday strangers across centuries would read them, dissect them, and perhaps judge you for the fears you could not hide? The battlefield ink is not just history. It is a whisper from the dead, echoing in our ears long after the cannons have gone silent. And as you turn the fragile pages in your imagination, remember, each sentence was written by someone who wondered if they would see the sun rise. Some did. Many did not. Their words outlived them, and in that survival, they achieved the only kind of immortality war can ever grant. Close your eyes, and imagine the sound of iron doors closing behind you. The echo is heavy, final, like the slam of destiny itself. The air is damp, smelling of stone and rust. You sit on a thin wooden bench, and in your hands is the only thing that belongs to you, a diary. For the silent prisoner, the diary becomes not just paper, but a companion, a confidant, and sometimes the last fragile proof that they still exist. In history, prison diaries have revealed truths that no official archive would dare to keep. In those cramped cells, words became rebellion. A prisoner may be gagged in the courtroom, silenced by guards, but inside their small notebook, their voice roared louder than chains. Take, for instance, the writings of political dissidents. Their diaries were filled not with self-pity, but with razor-sharp observations, coded metaphors, and secret instructions disguised as poetry. Some were smuggled out page by page, hidden in loaves of bread or sewn into clothing, as if the ink itself were a fugitive. But not all prison diaries spoke of politics. Many whispered the private agony of ordinary criminals, or the regrets of men and women who had lost everything. One prisoner wrote, "I forgot the sound of my child's laughter. I wrote it down today, but I cannot be sure if memory is tricking me. Perhaps I invented it. Perhaps freedom is only the imagination of the condemned." There is nothing more haunting than realizing that memory itself decays inside walls that never change. Picture the prisoner scratching words into the paper with a broken pencil, or sometimes even with charcoal from burned matches. The handwriting shifts, at first confident, then deteriorating, letters shaking like the pulse of despair. The pages become darker as time passes, not because the ink changes, but because the weight of isolation sinks deeper. Each sentence is not only a confession, but a survival tactic. Writing is breathing. Writing is screaming silently. Writing is refusing to vanish. And yet, in the middle of darkness, there were sparks of humor too. One prisoner scribbled, "If rats could vote, I would be king of this place. They follow me everywhere, even into my dreams." Such bitter jokes became lifelines. Because when the walls close in, sometimes laughter, no matter how twisted, becomes the only rebellion left. Now ask yourself, if you were locked in a cell for years, what would you write to keep yourself sane? Would you tell the truth, knowing it might be discovered by your captors? Would you create stories, inventing whole worlds just to escape the crushing sameness? Or would you, like many did, write letters to people who would never read them, pretending your words could fly through iron bars? The silent prisoner teaches us that confinement is not only physical, it is mental. It is the slow erosion of self. Diaries caught that erosion, turning invisible suffering into visible ink. And by doing so, they left us a chilling reminder. Freedom is not always about walking outside. Sometimes it is about speaking inside, even if no one hears. So when you think of the prisoner writing by candlelight, remember this: they were not only writing to survive their own night, but perhaps to reach across centuries to you. Their silence has ended because you are listening. Their words live, and in that, they are no longer prisoners at all. Imagine waking up in a village where the bells toll not for celebration, but for death. The Black Plague, sweeping across Europe in the 14th century, turned entire towns into graveyards. Streets once filled with laughter echoed only with cries of grief. And in the middle of this nightmare, people wrote. They wrote in journals, letters, and secret diaries that survived centuries. Each page is like a whisper from the edge of the apocalypse. The plague was not just a disease, it was terror itself. People described in their diaries the fear of touching loved ones, the guilt of abandoning family members, and the superstition that demons lurked in the fog. Priests wrote of endless funerals, too many to remember names. Some diaries reveal chilling details: carts rolling down cobbled streets piled high with bodies, children drawing pictures of skulls and rats in their margins. These were not novels. These were cries etched in ink, each line a plea to make sense of a world collapsing. One diary entry from Florence tells us, "Today, I saw a man collapse in the market. By the time I returned home, his wife was already carried away by neighbors. I washed my hands until they bled, but I still feel the sickness on my skin." That image lingers like a stain. These words remind us that fear was not abstract. It was physical, clinging, an invisible shadow no one could wash away. But even in this ocean of dread, there were moments of strange humor, as if people clung to laughter the way they clung to life. Some notes complain about doctors in beaked masks, looking more frightening than the disease itself. Others joked bitterly that wine was the only cure worth trying, and if you died, at least you would die happy. In the darkest years, gallows humor became medicine, proof that the human spirit refuses to surrender entirely. Science, of course, had not yet caught up. Germ theory was centuries away. Diaries instead record desperate remedies, carrying herbs in pockets, rubbing onions on the skin, burning sulfur in houses. Some believed cats and dogs carried the plague. Others slaughtered them, only to realize later that rats thrived without predators. Reading these words now, you sense the tragic irony. They did everything they could, and sometimes their very efforts made things worse. Think about this: if you had lived then, what would you have written in your diary? Would you confess your fear of neighbors, your doubts in God, or perhaps your anger at the unfairness of watching the healthy fall as suddenly as the weak? Diaries show us that people wrestled not only with disease, but with questions of meaning. Some entries are prayers begging for salvation. Others are curses hurled into the void. The plague was as much a spiritual catastrophe as it was a biological one. As you imagine turning those fragile pages, notice the stains, ink blotted by trembling hands, fingerprints smudged with soot, and sometimes dark circles where tears fell. These are not just relics of disease. They are the fingerprints of humanity clinging to existence. Every diary from the plague years whispers the same truth. Even in the shadow of death, people needed their words to live. The Black Plague ended centuries ago, yet the diaries remain. They are time capsules of fear, courage, and survival. They tell us not only how people died, but how they kept living, if only for another day. And as you close that imaginary diary, ask yourself, what shadow would your own words cast if you were writing at the end of the world? The wind howls across a barren landscape, carrying with it the sound of emptiness. You are alone, an explorer who has strayed too far into a place that no map dares to chart. The snow blinds you, or perhaps it is desert sand stinging your face. Your compass is broken, your supplies dwindling, and in your pack rests one last item that feels like an anchor: your diary. In this desolation, it becomes both confession and epitaph, the place where your final thoughts might be carved into history. Throughout time, explorers have left behind journals that read less like heroic adventure tales, and more like whispers of despair. They did not always find glory. More often, they found silence, hunger, and madness. One Arctic explorer scrawled, "The ice has swallowed the horizon. I am tired of the whiteness. Even my dreams are frozen." His diary, discovered years later beside his skeletal remains, carried not the triumph of discovery, but the weight of solitude that no civilization could imagine. These confessions are not grand speeches. They are survival written in ink. Each entry charts not just a journey across terrain, but across the human soul. Hunger appears on every page, sometimes as a complaint about stale bread, sometimes as a hallucination of feasts that never existed. Loneliness echoes in every line, as explorers wrote letters to family they would never send, or described conversations with companions who had already died. The diary became their last friend, the only listener in an endless wilderness. Yet, explorers often infused their darkest notes with strange humor. One sailor stranded at sea scribbled, "Day 43, the fish have begun ignoring me. I think they can sense my desperation. I am starting to consider myself the unwanted guest of the ocean." That bleak humor, sharp as salt, reminds us that even in the shadow of death, the human mind creates jokes to keep despair at bay. It is laughter clawing against oblivion. Science also lived in these pages. Explorers carefully noted weather patterns, stars overhead, or the migration of animals, data written with frozen hands or sand-choked eyes. These fragments later guided future generations, even if the original author never lived to see them used. Diaries of explorers became both tombstones and textbooks. They were not just dying words. They were seeds for others to continue. Now pause for a moment. Imagine yourself lost in an unforgiving wilderness, pen in hand. Would you write with hope, leaving messages for the world? Or would you unleash your bitterness, cursing the fate that led you here? Diaries show us that explorers wrestled with both. Some ended with prayers, begging that their families remember them kindly. Others ended with a single line, "I should not have come." The ink itself feels heavy with regret. As you turn these imaginary pages, you realize the explorer's diary is not just about discovery. It is about being human when no one is watching. It is about trying to leave behind a voice, however faint, so that even if the body disappears into snow or sand, the words might survive. And in those words, the lost explorer is never truly lost. They remain here, waiting for you to listen. So tonight, as you drift further into this journey, ask yourself, if you were the one stranded at the edge of the world, what confession would your last page hold? The walls are painted white, but they are not clean. They smell faintly of disinfectant, damp wood, and something heavier, something that clings to memory. You are sitting in a narrow room with barred windows, and the silence is broken only by distant footsteps and the occasional scream echoing down the hallway. This is not a prison, not exactly. It is an asylum, and in your lap rests a diary. For patients locked away in institutions of the past, diaries were their only bridge between sanity and madness. The history of asylums is littered with shadows. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, people were often confined not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient. Women with opinions too strong, men who drank too much, children who behaved oddly. Once admitted, many never left. Their diaries tell us stories not of cure, but of captivity. One entry reads, "They say I am sick." But if being sick means noticing the lies in their smiles, then perhaps sickness is clearer than health. Words like these make you wonder who was mad, the patient or the world outside. These diaries blur the line between reality and hallucination. Some pages describe daily routines, tasteless meals, endless medication, and the weight of locked doors. Others spiral into visions, angels perched on the rafters, whispers in the pipes, walls that breathe at night. For the writers, the act of writing became both rebellion and therapy. Every word scratched into paper was proof that they were still thinking, still alive, even if the doctors dismissed those thoughts as delusion. Yet, in the midst of horror, there is strange beauty. One patient wrote about the light that slipped through a crack in the window. "It comes at the same angle every morning, as if the sun still remembers me." Another described conversations with birds outside, claiming they were kinder listeners than any physician. These fragile notes remind us that even in confinement, the human spirit hunts for fragments of wonder, clinging to them like lifelines. And of course, humor crept in too. One diary complained that the cure involved more boredom than madness itself. "If they wanted to torture me, they should have let me attend staff meetings instead." I imagine hell is just endless conversations about laundry. Dark, bitter humor, but humor nonetheless, a reminder that laughter refuses to be locked up, no matter how strong the walls. Now ask yourself, If you were placed in such an asylum, your every word labeled as madness, would you keep writing? Would you document reality as you see it, even if no one believed you? Or would you surrender your pen, letting silence define you? Diaries from asylums teach us that to write is to resist. To write is to declare, I am here. I exist. I matter. As you imagine those whispers behind the walls, realize this: the patients may have been silenced in their lifetimes, but their words escaped. They slipped through cracks, survived in forgotten archives, and now they speak to us. In their murmurs, we hear not only madness, but humanity, the kind that refuses to die even when the world locks it away. Imagine writing a letter that will never reach its destination. You fold the paper carefully, address it to someone you love, and then tuck it into the back of a diary, as if hiding your heart between its pages. These are the letters never sent, entries disguised as correspondence, written by people who longed for connection but lived in silence. Diaries filled with these letters become a gallery of voices calling out across time, unanswered but not forgotten. Many such letters were written during times of separation. Soldiers far from home wrote to wives and children, not daring to mail them, fearing that their words would be censored or intercepted. Prisoners scrawled letters to mothers, knowing no guard would ever deliver them. Young lovers poured out their hearts to partners they were forbidden to see, leaving their declarations trapped forever in ink. One diary discovered in Paris contained dozens of folded notes, each beginning with "My dearest," but none ever sealed in an envelope. It was as if the diary itself became the postman, carrying messages into eternity. These letters, unsent and unread, are among the most intimate confessions humanity has left behind. Unlike public speeches or memoirs, they were not written with an audience in mind. They are raw, trembling, sometimes incoherent, but always honest. One entry reads, "I imagine you laughing as you read this, though I know you never will. Perhaps my words will wither with me, but if by some miracle they survive, let them prove that I loved you without end." Reading lines like this, you almost feel as though you are eavesdropping on a heartbeat. And yet, not all unsent letters were drenched in sorrow. Some brimmed with humor, a way to cope with isolation. A sailor stranded at sea wrote mock complaints to his dog back home. "I have caught 3 fish today, but none of them wagged their tails at me like you do." Ungrateful creatures. His diary pages, yellowed and water-stained, survive as both a record of survival and a quirky love letter to companionship. Humor turned even loneliness into something bearable, a reminder that affection could outlive absence. What is striking about these letters is how they reveal the tension between speech and silence. Why write something you know will never be read? The answer is simple: to keep the self alive. Writing became a way of talking when no listener existed. The act of addressing you gave the illusion of dialogue, saving writers from the crushing weight of solitude. In this way, diaries of unsent letters are not dead artifacts. They are ongoing conversations, waiting centuries to find their audience, us. Now pause for a moment. If you were to write a letter tonight that no one would ever read, what would you say? Would you confess a hidden truth, admit a regret, or whisper a love too fragile to share aloud? Perhaps the greatest power of these letters lies in the fact that they were never meant to be seen, which is why, when we read them, we encounter the purest reflections of the human heart. As you turn the fragile diary pages in your imagination, you can almost feel the weight of folded papers, ink bleeding into creases, words trembling across time. Letters never sent remind us that sometimes silence holds more meaning than speech. They tell us that love, grief, and longing do not vanish simply because they remain unread. They linger. They wait. And through you, they live again. Picture yourself in a dim, candlelit room. The walls are rough stone, the air heavy with smoke and fear. Outside, villagers whisper of curses and demons, their suspicion already turning toward you. You are a woman, or perhaps a man, accused of witchcraft. In your trembling hands lies a journal. Each page is not just writing. It is survival. For those branded as witches in the past, diaries became secret sanctuaries, places where forbidden thoughts and dangerous truths could be recorded when the world was determined to silence them. During the witch trials of Europe and early America, thousands were accused, often with little more evidence than gossip or envy. Their voices were rarely preserved in court records, which twisted truth into spectacle. But in rare moments, diaries reveal the other side. One such entry, found hidden beneath floorboards, read, "They call me witch because I know the names of herbs. They fear me because I heal without prayer. Yet I write these lines so that when they burn me, the truth will still have a voice." In those words, the diary itself becomes both shield and testimony. These journals blur the line between medicine, faith, and fear. Some pages carefully catalog herbs, recipes for remedies that today we might call early science. Others descend into pleas for mercy, prayers scribbled between smudged ink and tear stains. And still others are filled with bitterness. They ask me if I fly at night. I tell them yes in dreams where I escape their cruelty. Reading such confessions, you realize the so-called witches were not creatures of myth, but humans grappling with the terror of persecution. Yet even under threat of torture, humor slipped through their pens. One accused woman wrote mockingly, "If I were truly a witch, I would turn this stale bread into a feast and these guards into frogs." Alas, they remain men, uglier than frogs could ever be. This dark wit, tucked between fear and defiance, shows us that laughter is often the final rebellion. Ask yourself, if you lived in those times, would you dare to write in a diary? Every word could be evidence against you. To admit to dreams, to knowledge of plants, even to loneliness, might be twisted into proof of sorcery. Would you risk it, or would you keep silent, letting your truth rot away with you? The Witch's Journal forces us to confront this dilemma, the choice between silence and legacy. As you imagine turning the brittle pages, notice the ink blots where tears fell, the cramped handwriting as if rushed before discovery, the strange mix of spells, recipes, and heartfelt laments. These are not monsters speaking to us from the past. They are people, mothers, daughters, healers, whose lives were shattered by hysteria. Through their words, they survive. And through your listening, they are no longer alone. So tonight, when you think of witches, do not picture only broomsticks and cauldrons. Picture a small diary hidden under straw, waiting centuries for someone like you to read. In that fragile book, humanity whispers louder than superstition. The ocean has always been both a road and a grave. For centuries, sailors filled the world's diaries with stories that began in hope and ended in silence. Imagine a ship rocking on violent waves, lanterns swinging in the dark, and a trembling hand clutching a diary below deck. Outside, the storm howls. Inside, the ink bleeds onto paper, as if it knows the sea will soon claim it. These diaries, rescued from shipwrecks or left adrift in bottles, are whispers from beneath the ocean. One journal, found in the wreckage of a merchant ship in the 1700s, carried this final entry: "The sea groans like a living beast. The timbers cry with every wave. I kissed the crucifix tonight, not for salvation but for courage." Days later, the ship sank. The diary, sealed in oilskin, survived when its writer did not. Such words remind us that the ocean is not merely water, it is hunger, swallowing men whole, leaving only ink as their ghost. These sea-bound diaries are filled with vivid contradictions. Sailors cursed the endless monotony of calm waters, then begged for mercy when storms arrived. They wrote of rats devouring their bread, of salt sores burning on their skin, and of longing for land so desperately that even the smell of mud was imagined as paradise. Yet, amidst misery, they described sunsets so magnificent they believed heaven itself had opened. The ocean tested both body and soul, and the diary became the only witness to both torment and awe. And of course, there was humor, dark as tar. One sailor, stranded on a leaking vessel, scribbled, "We prayed for the sea to calm. It did, only because it is waiting to drown us with better timing." Generous beast. Another complained that the cook's soup tasted like rope soaked in seawater, with a hint of despair. These bitter jokes did not erase fear, but they gave sailors the courage to laugh into the abyss, refusing to let despair dictate their last words. Some diaries even slipped into the realm of the uncanny. Sailors described lights dancing on the horizon, voices rising from the waves, and shadows beneath the water that followed their ships for days. Were these hallucinations from exhaustion, or glimpses of mysteries science still cannot explain? The diaries do not tell us. They simply record what the eye saw and the hand wrote, leaving us to wonder whether the sea hides more than storms. Now imagine yourself on such a vessel. The wood creaks beneath your feet, the night air reeks of salt, and you know that tomorrow's sunrise is not guaranteed. With pen in hand, what would you write? Would you confess fear, send love to someone across the ocean, or simply describe the rhythm of the waves, so that your existence might not vanish entirely? The sea has no memory, but ink does. And so these diaries become lighthouses, fragile, flickering lights guiding us across centuries of silence. When you close your eyes tonight, you may hear the ocean's murmur, endless and indifferent. Remember that beneath its surface lie countless voices, drowned yet not destroyed. In their words, preserved against impossible odds, the lost sailors rise again. Their ships may be gone, their bones scattered, but their diaries float still, carrying their souls to you. Stone castles rise like giants from the past, their walls thick enough to hold silence for centuries. But silence never lasts forever. Deep in hidden chambers and dusty attics, diaries have been discovered, written not by kings or queens, but by the unseen people who served them. These pages reveal secrets buried behind the stone, whispers that the chronicles of power dared not record. Imagine a servant boy scribbling by candlelight in a drafty corridor, his diary hidden beneath straw in the stables. He writes about overhearing noble conspiracies, secret alliances, and midnight meetings where daggers glinted in torchlight. His words were never meant for royal ears, yet centuries later, they give us glimpses of treachery that official histories carefully omitted. One entry reads, "The king dined with his brother tonight. They laughed, but their eyes burned with the same hatred. I fear this castle is colder than the snow outside." These diaries are not just about politics. They speak of human longing within stone prisons. Ladies-in-waiting wrote about forbidden love with guards, cooks lamented hunger while preparing feasts for the nobility, and children sketched monsters in the margins, reflections of their fear of dungeons. The castle, often romanticized as a place of chivalry, was for many a place of shadows. The diaries unmask the fairy tale, showing cracks where cruelty seeped in. Humor, of course, finds its way even here. A chambermaid wrote bitterly, "The queen has 50 gowns but only one smile, and she uses it as sparingly as sugar." Another servant joked that rats were the true rulers of the castle, since even the king could not banish them. These small lines, tucked between accounts of betrayals and fear, reveal how ordinary people resisted despair by laughing at the absurdity of power. But not all entries were playful. Some described chilling superstitions, whispers of ghosts wandering towers, strange sounds from sealed crypts, and curses carved into stones by masons who died during construction. One servant confessed to writing prayers on scraps of parchment and hiding them in walls, believing the stones themselves could absorb fear. Whether superstition or not, the diary transforms the castle from a monument of power into a living organism, filled with secrets, sighs, and sorrows. Now ask yourself, if you had lived in such a fortress, what would you have written in your diary? Would you dare describe the treachery you saw? Would you mock your lords in private, or would you use your diary to dream of escape? Castles may seem timeless, but diaries remind us that behind those walls were fragile human hearts beating in rhythm with both love and terror. As you close this imagined journal, picture the castle looming under a stormy sky. Its stones may endure, but without the words of those who lived in its shadow, it would be nothing more than silent ruins. Thanks to their diaries, the castle speaks again, not in the voice of kings, but in the murmurs of the forgotten. Look up at the night sky. Imagine being so far from Earth that the stars are no longer pinpricks above you, but oceans of fire stretching endlessly around. You are an astronaut, adrift in silence, separated from everything you have ever known by infinite space. In your gloved hands is a small diary. Each word you write is both a scientific observation and a desperate attempt to tether your humanity to something real. The diaries of astronauts and cosmonauts, though often guarded by space agencies, sometimes reveal more than mission logs. Beyond checklists and calculations, they contain private reflections on loneliness, fear, and awe. One entry from an early cosmonaut read, "The stars do not twinkle here. They burn steady, merciless, like eyes that never close. I wonder if I am the one being observed." His words echo the ancient terror of gazing into the abyss, except this time, the abyss gazes back. These writings often blur the line between science and poetry. Astronauts meticulously describe the mechanics of docking or the curve of Earth's horizon, but then slip into confessions, the longing for a child's laughter, the ache of missing gravity's embrace, the eerie quiet where even one's own heartbeat feels too loud. One diary kept hidden for decades contained this haunting line: "I fear not dying in space, but living here too long, until I forget the taste of rain." In that sentence lies the essence of cosmic solitude. And yet humor floats here too, lighter than oxygen. One astronaut joked in his diary, "Space food is fine if you consider cardboard a delicacy. I dream of cheeseburgers orbiting me like satellites." Another wrote about naming a stubborn piece of equipment after his ex-wife, claiming it only worked when ignored. These moments of levity were survival mechanisms, laughter stitched into the fabric of silence. But solitude in space carries weight unlike any prison or battlefield. On Earth, a diary might connect you to someone across time. In orbit, it connects you across existence itself. Every word becomes a message to the future, to strangers who may one day stand where you floated. The diary is no longer just memory. It is testimony that humanity dared to reach beyond its cradle. Now imagine yourself there, staring at Earth from a small porthole, watching clouds swirl like brushstrokes on a blue canvas. Would you write about the beauty, or would you confess your fear that no one can hear you scream in this endless dark? Would you use your diary to dream of returning home, or to remind yourself that you once belonged to a planet of rivers, forests, and warm kitchens? The choice of what to write becomes, in itself, a fight for identity. As you picture those fragile pages filled with ink floating weightlessly, remember this: the stars may outlast us, but words are what make us more than dust. The starlit solitude is not silence at all. It is a dialogue between humanity and the universe, carried across paper, across centuries, across infinity, until it reaches you. The jungle is thick, almost suffocating, its canopy blotting out the sky. Every step sinks into mud, every sound echoes with unseen creatures. You are part of an expedition, one that promised glory, riches, or discovery. But as days turn into weeks, your supplies dwindle, companions fall ill, and whispers begin to spread that the land itself is cursed. In the middle of this chaos, someone keeps a diary. Each entry is less a travelogue and more a survival confession. History is filled with expeditions that ended not in triumph, but in tragedy. From the Amazon to the Arctic, explorers wrote their final thoughts in diaries that later became the only survivors. One journal from a doomed South American expedition contained this chilling line: "The forest is watching. I feel its eyes even when I close mine." Found years later, the diary was warped with mold, the words blurred, yet its terror remained alive. The jungle, it seemed, had swallowed not only bodies but voices, except for those caught in ink. These expedition diaries reveal the unraveling of human spirit. At first, the entries brim with optimism, descriptions of strange birds, sketches of rivers, lists of medicinal plants. But slowly, words darken. Complaints about insects turn into nightmares of swarms. Notes about missing supplies give way to accusations of theft and betrayal. One desperate entry read, "We argue more than we walk. The gold we sought has turned to poison in our minds." You can almost hear the expedition collapsing, not just in the wilderness, but in their trust of one another. And then comes the uncanny. Many such diaries describe eerie events: fires that start without cause, compasses spinning wildly, voices calling at night from nowhere. Were these illusions of fever and fear, or did the explorers truly encounter something beyond reason? One explorer wrote, "Last night I saw our dead companion walking at the edge of camp. He smiled, though we buried him days ago." No science can untangle whether this was madness, myth, or something more. The diary does not explain. It simply records. Amidst despair, humor flickers like fireflies. A member of one ill-fated journey scribbled, "If we ever make it home, I vow never to complain about city noise again. Give me carriages, bells, and drunkards, anything but mosquitoes." That bitter laughter became the last rebellion, proof that even cursed expeditions could not strip humanity of its wit. Now imagine yourself there, sweating in the oppressive heat, swatting insects, staring at dwindling rations. Would you keep writing in your diary? Would you admit fear or try to disguise it with bravado? Would you record the strange lights in the jungle or dismiss them as fever dreams? The diary forces you to face the wilderness not only outside, but inside your own mind. As you turn the mold-stained pages in your imagination, You realize these cursed expeditions were not only about lost maps. They were about the fragility of human hope. Ink became the last rope thrown into the abyss, tying voices of the past to us. And in those voices, the cursed expedition never truly ends. It marches on, waiting for someone like you to listen. Not all diaries whisper about war, curses, or death. Some bleed with a different kind of torment, love that could never be spoken aloud. Imagine holding a small leather-bound book, its pages trembling with confessions written in secret ink, hidden under pillows or behind loose bricks in the wall. These are the pages of forbidden love, where desire is trapped not by chains, but by laws, traditions, and fear of judgment. Across centuries, countless hearts poured their secrets into diaries because they could not speak them to the world. A noblewoman in 16th century Spain wrote about her love for a lowly stable boy, calling him the only light in a life gilded but empty. Her diary survived long after her death, discovered in an attic centuries later, her voice echoing louder than any arranged marriage ever could. In Japan, a samurai confessed in his diary his devotion to another warrior, a bond that was both brotherhood and something more. His words were never meant for the ears of his clan, but history preserved them anyway. These diaries are filled with trembling contradictions, fear and longing, guilt and joy. Writers confess to touching hands in secret gardens, to stolen glances at banquets, to dreams that carried them through nights of loneliness. One heartbreaking entry reads, "I prayed that my love would vanish, for it brings only danger." But each prayer ended with their name. Such lines are not just words, they are wounds carved in ink. And yet, within this pain, humor flickers too. A young student in 19th century England wrote mockingly about the absurdity of hiding his affection. "I have mastered Latin, Greek, and mathematics, but I still cannot master the art of pretending not to love him." His diary, fragile and yellowed, reveals that even in repression, laughter remained a survival tactic. These confessions also reflect the societies that condemned them. Religion, class, and law all worked together to forbid love that strayed beyond accepted lines. To write in a diary was to commit both rebellion and preservation, to shout silently, "I was here. I loved. Do not erase me." In a way, these forbidden pages are more enduring than any public vow, because they were written with the raw urgency of hearts that knew they might never be allowed to love openly. Now pause for a moment. If you had lived in such a world, would you risk writing your forbidden feelings? Would you rather let silence bury your truth, or carve it into paper, knowing it could one day condemn you or immortalize you? The act of writing becomes a question of courage, where every word is both a danger and a lifeline. As you imagine turning these secret pages, picture the stains of ink smudged by trembling hands, the pressed flowers tucked between them as symbols of silent devotion, the hurried lines written by candlelight before someone entered the room. These are not the voices of scandal, but of humanity. They remind us that love, even forbidden, refuses to be erased. Through ink, it finds eternity. So tonight, as you reflect on these forbidden diaries, ask yourself, what loves of today might still be hidden, waiting for centuries to pass before the world is ready to hear them? In the hushed silence of stone cloisters, monks bent over parchment by candlelight, scratching words that were meant for God, or so it seemed. But hidden among chants, copied scriptures, and records of harvests, some monks kept secret chronicles, diaries never intended for the eyes of their abbots. These pages reveal the humanity behind the robes: doubt, temptation, anger, even rebellion. A monk in the 13th century wrote, "I prayed for silence, yet my heart screams. They call me holy, but my thoughts wander like wolves." His diary, discovered centuries later in a monastery archive, showed a man torn between devotion and desire. Far from the perfect image of purity, his words reveal the conflict of a soul locked not only in cloisters but within itself. Monastic diaries often carried contradictions. They recorded endless hours of prayer, yet confessed boredom so deep it gnawed at the spirit. Some monks admitted to falling asleep during vigils, or scribbled jokes about the abbot's snoring echoing louder than the bells. One entry mockingly observed, "Our fasting is strict, yet Brother Thomas manages to look fatter each week. Surely a miracle, or perhaps his private stash of cheese." Laughter in the margins shows us monks were not saints carved in stone, but men grappling with ordinary human frailties. But these chronicles also reveal darker shadows. Some monks wrote about witnessing corruption in their abbeys, wealth hoarded, vows broken, punishments inflicted in the name of discipline. A chilling line from a 15th century chronicle reads, "Confession here is not for absolution but for control. We tell them our sins, and they bind us tighter with chains of guilt." Such entries remind us that even places built for salvation could become prisons of the soul. And yet, beauty lives in these pages too. Many monks wrote with awe about the natural world. The flight of swallows across cloisters, the way dawn light painted stained glass into living fire, the peace found in copying illuminated manuscripts. One monk confessed, "I think God hides in the colors of ink more than in sermons." These diaries capture the tension of faith, doubt, and devotion woven together, as fragile as parchment itself. Ask yourself, if you were cloistered away, living a life of silence and obedience, would you risk writing your secret thoughts? Would you confess your doubts to paper, even knowing discovery could mean punishment? The monk's secret chronicle was more than rebellion. It was survival, a way to remain human in a world that demanded perfection. As you imagine turning those fragile pages, picture ink faded to brown, margins filled with tiny doodles of birds or faces, the trembling handwriting of someone who dared to hide a second life in words. These chronicles remind us that holiness is not absence of struggle, but the presence of humanity within it. And through their diaries the monks whisper still, across centuries of silence. The trenches were not walls of defense. They were graves dug in advance, waiting for the men who crouched inside them. Imagine the endless stretch of mud, the barbed wire glinting under a pale moon, the stench of rot hanging heavier than the fog. You sit with your back pressed against dirt, rain dripping from your helmet, and in your hand is a diary. Each word you write is an act of defiance against a war that wants to erase your humanity. Soldiers in World War I filled diaries with images that no textbook could capture. They wrote of rats so large they seemed like fellow soldiers, of lice that feasted without cease, of boots rotting from weeks in sludge. Yet alongside this misery were lines about camaraderie, a cigarette shared in silence, a song hummed under bombardment, a joke whispered as shells fell. One soldier recorded, "We laughed today when Jenkins slipped face first into the muck. Laughter in hell tastes sharper than wine." The diary became a fragile shield, keeping sanity alive when the world above was madness. But the shadows in the trenches were not only physical. They were psychological, gnawing at the soul. Soldiers wrote about nightmares that blurred into reality, about fear so constant it became routine, about longing for a sunrise that did not mean another attack. A young private confessed, "I have not felt like myself in months. The war has eaten me, and only the shell of my body remains." His words survived though his body did not, a ghost captured in ink. There were also superstitions. Diaries speak of men convinced that certain numbers meant death, or that carrying a photo of a loved one would protect them more than any helmet. Some wrote about hearing phantom footsteps in no man's land, or voices calling from the dark. Were these delusions, or echoes of trauma so deep that the earth itself seemed to whisper back? The diary does not judge. It only records. Humor, again, pushed its way into the mud. One soldier joked, "If the army ever runs out of bullets, they could throw our boots. The smell alone would kill the enemy." Another scribbled, "They tell us we fight for king and country. I think we fight mostly for the chance to laugh again one day." These words remind us that even in trenches filled with shadow, light flickered through in the form of laughter. Now pause and imagine, if you were trapped in that muddy labyrinth, pen scratching on damp paper, what would you write? Would you write letters home, disguising the horror with hope? Or would you tell the truth, knowing it might haunt those you love? The diary in the trenches forces us to confront the hardest question: how much of the truth should be preserved? As you turn these imagined pages, picture the smudges of mud, the stains of blood, the cramped handwriting of men writing by the dim glow of lanterns. These diaries are not just records of war. They are echoes of lives lived briefly but intensely, shadows pressed into paper. And through their words, the trenches speak again, not with cannons, but with voices that refuse to be silenced. The cabin looks harmless from the outside, a crooked roof, smoke rising from a weary chimney, the kind of place travelers might mistake for shelter. But once inside, the air feels wrong. The wooden beams groan even when the wind is still, Shadows stretch longer than they should, and the silence presses like a weight. On a dusty table lies a diary, its leather cracked, its pages brittle. As you open it, the words pull you into the haunted story of those who once stayed here. One entry begins simply, "The night is colder inside than out." The writer, a lonely trapper in the 1800s, describes how he heard whispers each evening, though the nearest village was miles away. Another entry, scrawled shakily, reads, "I nailed the windows shut, but the eyes still watch from the dark." The handwriting breaks off mid-sentence, as if the author was interrupted, or worse. No one knows what became of him, but the diary remains, soaked in dread. Haunted cabin diaries often blur the line between folklore and confession. Some contain sketches of strange symbols carved into walls. Others record dreams too vivid to ignore. Faceless figures standing at the foot of the bed, children's laughter echoing in empty rooms, or doors that opened themselves at night. Skeptics might dismiss them as the writings of fever or madness, yet why do so many of these stories echo one another? Could isolation itself conjure phantoms, or was something truly lingering in the wood and stone? And then there is the dark humor of the doomed. One entry mockingly declared, "If this cabin is cursed, then at least it has better company than the tavern back home." Another scrawled line noted, "I asked the ghosts to split firewood for me. They declined." Bitter laughter hidden between fear shows us that even in haunted places, humanity insists on a joke, however desperate. But the terror runs deeper than shadows. Some diaries reveal the slow unraveling of the mind, as solitude turns fear into obsession. One trapper wrote, "I stopped counting days. Time does not pass here. The clock ticks, but I no longer believe it." His words are a chilling reminder that the true haunting may not be spirits, but the human mind when it is left too long in silence. Pause for a moment. Imagine yourself in that cabin, snow falling outside, wind clawing at the shutters. Would you dare to write down what you see, or fear that writing it makes it real? Would you describe the scratching at the walls, or the face you think you glimpsed in the frost? Or would you close the diary, refusing to give fear a voice? The haunted cabin forces the choice between silence and surrender. As you picture the fragile pages, smell the mildew of damp wood, and see the ink blotched by trembling hands, realize this: the ghosts may or may not exist, but the fear was real. The diary is proof. It tells us that sometimes the scariest thing is not what lurks outside, but what survives inside our imagination. And long after the cabin collapses, the words remain, haunting you. The cell is barely large enough to stand in. Stone walls drip with moisture, iron bars cut off even the faintest hope of freedom. Yet in the corner, beneath a pile of straw, lies a diary. For prisoners throughout history, ink became their last rebellion. When chains bound their bodies, words carried their souls beyond the walls. Some of the most haunting diaries come from political prisoners. A French revolutionary wrote on scraps of cloth torn from his clothes, "They can silence my speech, but not my pen. Every word I write escapes with the rats." Another prisoner in the Spanish Inquisition etched letters into wood, knowing the guards might burn it. His words still read, "Truth burns brighter than fire." These fragments survived not because they were meant to, but because desperation made them immortal. Prison diaries reveal the raw anatomy of captivity. They speak of hunger gnawing like an animal, of nights where silence is broken only by distant screams, of friendships formed in whispers through walls. One prisoner confessed, "We pass our stories like smuggled bread. It is the only nourishment that does not rot." His metaphor is stark. Stories kept him alive when food could not. And yet, humor crawled into these dark places too. A prisoner scribbled bitterly, "The warden says I should reflect on my sins. I have, and concluded my greatest sin was getting caught." Another joked about rats being better company than the guards. At least the rats did not shout orders. These lines of dark comedy show how laughter itself can gnaw through despair, one grin at a time. But there are darker shadows still. Some prisoners described hallucinations, walls closing in, ghosts of those executed before them, or voices calling from beyond. Were these delusions, or truths born from suffering? One diary reads, "I saw my own body hanging in the courtyard before the gallows was built. They will kill me twice." Whether real or imagined, such visions remind us that prisons were not just cages of stone, but cages of the mind. Pause for a moment. If you were locked in such a cell, would you dare to write? Every page could be seized as evidence. Every word might condemn you further. Yet to remain silent would mean surrender. Prison diaries are proof that even when stripped of everything, freedom, comfort, dignity, a human being can still resist with ink. Writing becomes a declaration: I exist. You cannot erase me. As you picture those fragile pages smudged with sweat and blood, think of the hands that clutch them in darkness. These are not just confessions of criminals, but testaments of survival, rebellion, and humanity. Through their words, prisoners refuse to vanish into silence. And when we read them, we set them free again. Fire is both destroyer and confessor. When flames rise, diaries often become their final offering, their words curling into smoke as if whispered to the heavens. And yet some survive, pages charred at the edges, ink half melted, but voices still legible. These fire-kissed diaries tell us not only of disasters endured, but of the resilience of those who lived through them. One such diary, recovered after the Great Fire of London in 1666, bore these words: "The air itself burns. The sky is not sky but furnace. I ran with nothing but this book, though I feared it would ignite in my hands." The diary was scorched, yet its entries remained. Through the ashes we hear not only fear but the desperate clinging to identity. If the city falls, let at least these words prove I was here. Fires throughout history have turned diaries into time capsules of catastrophe. From families fleeing burning villages to survivors of bombed cities in World War I, people wrote with urgency as if their ink could hold back flames. One Japanese woman in Hiroshima wrote, "The light came first, then silence. My pen shakes as I write, though my body may not last the night." Her diary was found among rubble, half burned, half saved, a fragile bridge between the living and the dead. And still, humor flickered in the smoke. A man in Chicago, after the 1871 fire, scribbled, "My house is gone, my shoes are gone, and I believe even my shadow has abandoned me." Still, the rats did not survive either, so perhaps it is a victory. That dark humor, half grief and half defiance, shows us how laughter endures even when the world turns to ash. But fire also carries symbolism. In many diaries, flames are described not only as destruction but as judgment, cleansing, or transformation. Some believed their suffering was punishment from God. Others believed it was a chance for renewal. One survivor wrote, "The fire has taken everything except my memory. Perhaps it has given me freedom." Whether despair or hope, the flames carved meaning into words as much as they carved scars into cities. Now imagine yourself with diary in hand, flames creeping along the walls, smoke filling your lungs. Would you write until the last moment trying to save your thoughts, or would you throw the diary into the fire deliberately, letting it become ash along with your past? The act of writing in fire is both defiance and surrender, a paradox burned into history. As you picture the charred pages fragile as autumn leaves, remember this: not all voices were lost to the flames. Some survived blackened but unbroken, carrying messages through centuries. Fire may consume buildings, bodies, and empires, but ink, against all odds, often finds a way to speak again. Through these diaries, the ashes are not silence. They are testimony. The road stretches endlessly, dust clinging to every step, sun beating down without mercy. You walk not for riches, not for conquest, but for something more elusive: faith, redemption, or perhaps escape. Along the way, you carry a small diary, pages worn soft from travel. Each night, by flickering firelight or in the corner of a crowded hostel, you write. These are the chronicles of the silent pilgrim. Pilgrim diaries often begin with hope, filled with prayers for safe passage and visions of holy sites. One medieval pilgrim wrote, "I go to seek God, but already I have found him in the kindness of strangers." But as the journey wore on, the tone shifted. Pages filled with blisters, hunger, and theft. Pilgrims confessed to losing faith with each weary mile. If heaven demands so much pain, perhaps it is already hell. The diary became a mirror, reflecting not the road alone, but the soul stripped bare upon it. Some pilgrims described encounters that blurred the natural and supernatural. A traveler in the 15th century wrote of hearing bells in a forest where no church stood, of lights dancing across mountaintops, of voices that guided him when he strayed from the path. Were these miracles or hallucinations born of exhaustion? The diary does not answer. It only bears witness to wonder, leaving us to question whether faith itself conjures visions. Even in the darkest journeys, humor surfaced. One pilgrim, robbed 3 times in a single month, wrote bitterly, "I am learning that thieves are more faithful companions than saints. They appear at every turn." Another joked that his feet had become relics worthy of veneration, for they suffer more than any martyr. These wry notes reveal that laughter, even faint, carried them further than despair could. Pilgrim diaries also remind us of the contradictions in seeking holiness. Some pilgrims confess they embarked not from devotion, but from guilt, or from the hope that their sins might be erased by walking. Others admitted they fled broken lives, using the pilgrimage as an excuse to disappear. In one diary, a man revealed, "I sought God, but what I truly sought was distance from myself." Such words strike at the heart of the pilgrim's paradox. The road outward often became a road inward. Now imagine yourself on that long road, feet aching, eyes fixed on a distant horizon. What would you write in your diary? Would you record the beauty of sunrise over hills, or confess the bitterness of your doubts? Would you cling to the promise of redemption, or admit that what you sought cannot be found at any shrine? The Pilgrim's Diary challenges us to ask whether the journey matters more than the destination. As you turn the fragile pages in your imagination, picture them stained with sweat, dirt, and candle soot. These are not just travel notes. They are maps of longing, faith, and fragility. Through them, we hear the footsteps of those who walked before us, silent pilgrims whose voices remain alive, waiting for you to follow. The sea crashes endlessly against jagged rocks, its roar mingling with the groan of a solitary tower. At the top of the lighthouse, the lantern sweeps its lonely circle across the waves, but inside a single figure keeps watch. He is the last lighthouse keeper, his only companion a diary resting on a wooden desk scarred with salt and time. His entries are sparse at first, notes about the weather, the ships that passed, the repairs he made to the lantern. But slowly, the diary turns inward. "I waved at a ship today. They did not wave back. Perhaps they did not see me. Or perhaps I am already invisible." The keeper begins to confess loneliness, the kind that gnaws like the tide, wearing him away grain by grain. Other entries blur into the uncanny. At night I hear footsteps on the stairs. I climb to check, but there is never anyone. The sea is loud, but the silence between its crashes is louder still. Another chilling line reads, "Sometimes I wonder if I am the keeper, or if the lighthouse keeps me." In those words lies the haunting paradox of isolation, the prison disguised as duty. And yet humor survives here too, sharp as salt spray. One entry, "The gulls are my counsel. They argue endlessly about nothing and steal my bread. Politicians with feathers." Another notes with bitter wit, "The sea brings messages in bottles. None are for me." Typical. These scraps of laughter reveal the stubborn resilience of a man refusing to drown in silence. The diary also captures the raw intimacy of a man's dialogue with the sea. He describes waves as living things, storms as angry gods, and the horizon as a promise he can never reach. One haunting confession, "The ocean speaks in a language I almost understand. If I stay long enough, I fear I will answer." His words blur the line between sanity and surrender, the sea becoming both companion and captor. Pause for a moment. Imagine yourself in that lighthouse, storms raging, glass rattling in the lantern room. Would you write about your duty, ships saved, lights tended, or about your aching solitude? Would your diary be a logbook or a confession? The lighthouse keeper's diary asks whether we can endure silence without letting it consume us. As you turn the imagined pages, smell the salt, feel the paper warped by damp air. These are not just records of tides and storms. They are fragments of a man's soul, a testament carved against the loneliness of endless watch. Through his diary, the light of the lighthouse does more than guide ships. It reaches across time, reminding us that even in solitude, a voice endures. The streets are silent, not because they are empty, but because they are filled with fear. Windows are shuttered, church bells toll endlessly, and carts creak under the weight of the dead. In times of plague, people reached for diaries not to make sense of the horror, but simply to record that they lived, if only for a little while longer. These are the whispers of the plague, fragile voices preserved in ink when the world itself seemed to wither. A 14th century diary from Florence during the Black Death reads, "They say the air itself is poisoned. I hold my breath as I write, though the ink still smells of death. Another, from London in 1665, notes, "Each morning I rise and count which neighbors have not. The silence grows heavier than any sermon." These words, penned centuries apart, echo with the same dread, the awareness that death was not at the city's edge, but at its very door. Plague diaries often reveal contradictions of faith and despair. Some saw the sickness as divine punishment, writing prayers across entire pages. "If we are to die, let us die as martyrs." Others cursed God with equal passion. "If this is mercy, then I have no wish to see his wrath." The ink became a battlefield of belief, where hope and doubt wrestled for every line. Superstition often crept in as well. People described charms tied around their necks, herbs burned in desperate smoke, and strange remedies passed in whispers. One diarist wrote, "I hung garlic in every corner, but still the coughs came. I wonder if the rats laugh at us." Even in catastrophe, dark humor pushed its way onto the page, as if mocking the futility of human effort. Yet diaries also preserved the small mercies. A mother wrote about her child's laugh, rare but radiant in a house surrounded by sickness. A young man recorded that he shared bread with a neighbor too weak to fetch his own. These moments remind us that even in plague, kindness did not die. It became sharper, more necessary, a fragile light against encroaching darkness. Pause for a moment. Imagine yourself in that time, streets filled with silence, the smell of smoke and sickness in the air. Would you write to leave proof that you endured? Or would you hide, fearing that naming the plague might call it closer? The act of writing during pestilence was both courage and defiance, a refusal to let death claim the last word. As you picture these fragile pages spotted with ink, tears, and sometimes even blood, remember this: the plague took millions of lives, but not every voice. Through diaries, whispers of fear and survival carried forward across centuries to reach you. They remind us that while the plague silenced streets, it never silenced the human will to speak. The battlefield is never silent. Even after the cannons stop, the ground itself hums with echoes, groans of the wounded, the cawing of crows, the clatter of steel dropped by dying hands. Yet amid this chaos, some soldiers found the strength to write. Their diaries are not polished histories, but raw cries, blood mixed with ink, truth bleeding onto fragile paper. One journal from the American Civil War begins, I write, "As men scream around me. The earth drinks their blood faster than rain." Another, from the Napoleonic Wars, simply states, "The mud is thicker than courage." These stark lines capture not strategy or glory, but the immediate human cost. To write in such moments was not only brave, it was nearly impossible, and therefore sacred. Many battlefield diaries confess the unbearable weight of survival. A soldier at Verdun wrote, "I buried my friend today with my own hands. Tomorrow, I must bury another. I no longer fear death. I fear what living makes me." Such words reveal that war kills not only the body but reshapes the soul, leaving men haunted long after the smoke clears. And yet, humor still dared to rise from the carnage. A Union soldier joked, "They say the South has better horses. I say we have better mud, and mud never runs away." Another scribbled during a lull, "The general says we march to glory. My feet say we march to blisters." These bitter grins in ink remind us that even when drenched in blood, laughter was sometimes the last weapon left. Superstition also crept across the battlefield. Soldiers wrote about carrying lucky coins, pieces of cloth from home, or prayers stuffed into boots. One diary described a man who refused to remove a feather from his hat, convinced it shielded him from bullets. He died with the feather intact, but the diary outlived him. Such pages capture both the desperation and fragile hope of men trapped between life and death. Now pause. Imagine yourself on that battlefield, smoke stinging your eyes, the ground trembling beneath each blast. Would you write your fear, your grief, your shame, or would you hide it, pretending courage even to the page? To confess in a battlefield journal was to surrender not to the enemy, but to truth itself. As you picture these blood-stained pages smudged and torn, remember that they are not just relics of war. They are human voices, refusing to vanish beneath banners and statistics. Through their words, the battlefield still breathes, not with the roar of cannons, but with whispers of those who bled and dared to write. Exile is a prison without walls. The land you once called home drifts farther with every mile, until even the sound of its language feels foreign on your tongue. In such loneliness, Many exiles turned to diaries, not to record events for others, but to keep themselves from dissolving into silence. These notebooks of the banished are maps of longing, grief, and survival. A Russian exile in Siberia during the 19th century wrote, "The snow is endless, like punishment made visible. I write so that I do not disappear into the white." Another, forced from Spain during the Inquisition, confessed, "They burned my house, but the ashes follow me still. I carry them in every breath." For these writers, ink became a tether to identity when everything else had been stripped away. Exile diaries often speak of hunger, not just for food, but for belonging. People described how bread never tasted the same away from home, how songs turned bitter when sung in a foreign land. One man wrote, "Even my dreams are in exile. I dream of my mother's voice, but it speaks to me in a language I no longer understand." The ache of dislocation seeped into every line. Yet humor found its way into the margins. One exile, stranded in a bleak settlement, scribbled, "They told me the climate was mild. Mild only if compared to hellfire." Another wrote, "The goats here are my best friends. They listen better than my neighbors ever did." That bitter laughter was not just survival, it was resistance, a refusal to surrender completely to despair. But the deepest notes of these notebooks are questions of identity. Who are you when your home is gone? Are you the person you were, or someone new shaped by exile? One diarist admitted, "I left my country, but I wonder if my country also left me." In those words lies the torment of the banished. Exile does not just take land. It takes certainty of self. Pause and imagine yourself far from home, cut off from everything familiar. Would you write to keep your language alive, to remind yourself of who you are, or would you write in the new tongue, trying to belong? The Exile's Notebook asks not only how we endure loss, but how we preserve or transform ourselves through it. As you picture these weathered pages, edges curled by damp, ink blurred by tears, remember this: exile is not only displacement of the body, but exile of the heart. And yet, through Diaries, the voices of the exiled never vanish. They wander still, reaching across centuries, whispering that even when torn from home, the human spirit insists on being heard. The laboratory smells of smoke and chemicals, glass vials clinking like nervous teeth as they rattle on the table. In the center lies a notebook, its pages filled not with published theories but with private doubts, confessions, and dangerous hopes. This is the diary of a scientist at the edge, of discovery, of madness, of death. One entry reads, "They believe I am close to success. I fear instead I am close to catastrophe." The scientist describes late nights where flames leapt too high, powders hissed like serpents, and silence afterward felt heavier than thunder. His diary is part record, part confession, calculations mingled with trembling words like, "If I vanish, let this book prove why." Many such diaries belong to men and women whose work skirted danger. Alchemists in the Middle Ages scribbled notes about potions that promised gold but delivered poison. A 19th century chemist wrote, "The liquid glows faintly in darkness. It is beautiful, but I dare not touch it again." We now know he was describing radium, his beautiful poison. His notebook, faintly luminous, outlived him by decades. But not all entries are solemn. Scientists too clung to humor when shadow crept too close. One man wrote, "Today I discovered 3 things: that ether evaporates too quickly, that my assistant snores too loudly, and that I should probably stop setting things on fire indoors." Another joked, "If this experiment kills me, I expect someone to at least publish it under my name." Even at the edge of danger, wit sparkled in ink. Yet the most haunting passages are not about explosions or poison, but about isolation. A physicist in the 20th century confessed, "I am surrounded by colleagues, but my ideas make me lonelier than any desert." Another, on the brink of despair, wrote, "What if the universe is not meant to be understood? What if every answer births only another abyss?" The diary became the only place to release such forbidden doubts. Pause for a moment. Imagine yourself in that lab, light flickering, the air heavy with smoke. Would you write of triumph or of terror? Would you record data cleanly? Or let your trembling hand scrawl truths too raw for journals? The scientist's final experiment was often not in glassware, but in words, the experiment of leaving behind an unguarded self. As you picture these notebooks stained with acid burns, corners scorched by flame, margins crowded with frantic equations, remember this: discovery and destruction often shared the same room. Through their diaries, we hear not the certainty of science, but the fragile humanity of those who dared to chase its fire. Grief is the heaviest ink. It seeps into paper more deeply than joy, clinging like a shadow that refuses to fade. Among the most haunting diaries are those of widows, women who turned to the page when their voices cracked with sorrow. These last pages are not just mourning, they are attempts to stitch together life from fragments of loss. One widow in 18th century France wrote, "The house is full of him, yet empty. His boots stand by the door as if waiting for feet that will never return." Another, during the American Civil War, confessed, "I speak to his portrait each night. The silence answers more faithfully than any prayer." These words reveal not only love, but the unbearable echo of its absence. Widows' diaries often describe the daily rituals of remembering. Some recorded the meals they still cooked for two, the walks they took alone along familiar paths, the letters they wrote but never sent. One heartbreaking line reads, "I set his place at the table tonight. I told myself it was habit, but it was hope." Through ink, grief found structure, a rhythm that helped the living endure. Yet strangely, humor sometimes crept into even these pages. One widow scribbled, "I miss him dearly, but not his snoring. Perhaps heaven is quieter than my bed ever was." Another joked bitterly, "He promised to love me forever." Forever, it turns out, is shorter than expected. These lines do not erase pain, but they show how laughter can live alongside tears, fragile but real. More haunting still are the widows who wrote their diaries as farewells. A woman in Victorian England ended hers with, "I have written enough. If anyone finds this, know that I loved. That is all." Her diary stopped there, no final date, only silence. The page itself became a gravestone, words carved in ink instead of stone. Now pause and imagine. If you had lost the person you loved most, would you turn to a diary? Would you fill its pages with grief, or would you lock it away, fearing the pain of seeing their name? The widow's last pages remind us that writing is not only memory, it is resistance against forgetting, a way of saying love was here. Do not erase it. As you picture these fragile books, their ink blurred by tears, think of the hands that trembled as they wrote, and of the courage it takes to record despair. Through widows' diaries, we inherit more than sorrow. We inherit proof that love, once lived, does not die. It lingers in words, waiting for new eyes to read, new hearts to feel. And so we close the book on these darkest diaries, pages filled with war, exile, love, silence, and grief. But even in their shadows, one truth remains: as long as words are written, voices never truly vanish. Thank you for staying with me through this journey into ink and memory. If these stories touched you, please like the video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these voices alive. Now I want to hear from you. Which diary moved you the most? And what kind of hidden stories would you like me to explore next? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I will be reading every one.